Time for passage 4. This is a dual passage. Passage 1 is adapted from Talleyrand et al. Report on Public Instruction, published in 1791. Passage 2 is adapted from this. Talleyrand was a French diplomat. The report was a plan for national education. Wollstonecraft, a British novelist and political writer, wrote Vindication in response to Talleyrand. Okay, so they are responding to each other, or at least the second passage we know will be a response to the first. So let's go ahead and do the first question. As used in line 21, common most nearly means. So let's find common. And let's start reading. That half the human race is excluded by the other half from any participation in government, that they are native by birth but foreign by law in the very land where they were born, and that they are property owners yet have no direct influence or representation, are all political phenomena apparently impossible to explain on abstract principle. But on another level of ideas, the question changes and may be easily resolved. The purpose of all these institutions must be the happiness of the greatest number. Everything that leads us farther from this purpose is an error. Everything that brings us closer is truth. If the exclusion from public employments decreed against women leads to a greater sum of mutual happiness for the two sexes, then this becomes a law that all societies have been compelled to acknowledge and sanction. Any other ambition would be a reversal of our primary destinies, and it will never be in women's interest to change the assignment they have received. It seems to us incontestable that our common happiness, above all that of women, requires that they never aspire to the exercise of political rights and functions. Okay, so common here means like shared or joint, right? Because the men and the women are sharing this happiness, right? It's common happiness. It's all talking about, the greatest good for the greatest number, a community level, a societal level. So common here means it's not the opposite of rare. In this case, it means what they have in common. In other words, what's shared or joint. Okay, average. Nope, that does not even. I guess the common man, the average man, maybe that's kind of one way to think about it, but that's not how average or common is being used in this sentence. Shared, of course, works. Coarse. I don't even think that's a synonym of common, really. Similar, common, no. Be careful. You might think that our similar happiness, that might work because men and women are similarly sharing this or something like that. But that's not as good, right? It's B, shared, right? Because it's something that they have in common that's joint between them. Okay, this one is an inference question about passage 1, though. We have perhaps a keyword here. Household and raising children. We have a place to look, 4 to 35. Notice we've already read up to 24, and I haven't seen anything yet about household and raising children. So let's keep reading. Let's keep reading until we get to line 35, and hopefully we'll find something about household and raising children. Here we must seek their interests in the wishes of nature. Is it not apparent that their delicate constitutions, their peaceful inclinations, and the many duties of motherhood set them apart from strenuous habits and onerous duties, and summon them to gentle occupations and the cares of the home? And is it not evident that the great conserving principle of societies, which makes the division of powers a source of harmony, has been expressed and revealed by nature itself, when it divided the functions of the two sexes in so obviously distinct a manner? So, what would be running a household and raising children? What would be what we can infer from this? What they believe about this? All we can really say so far is that they think this is what women should do, that they shouldn't aspire to political or economic power because their place is in the home and they are best and most adjusted and most appropriate to be in the home. That would be the argument in passage 1. Let's see what we have in the choices. Running a household and raising children are rewarding for men as well as women, just the opposite, right? The whole point is that there are men's duties and jobs and there are women's duties and jobs, and these kinds of things, running a household, raising children, those are women's type jobs. Yield less value for society than do roles performed by men. They don't say that specifically, and if anything, just the opposite. The point is that there are certain jobs that must be done in society. According to passage 1, men should do these jobs, women should do the others. Entail very few activities that are difficult or unpleasant. Notice, if we remember this portion of the passage, Is it not apparent that their delicate constitutions, in other words, their frail bodies, their peaceful inclinations, and the many duties of motherhood set them apart from strenuous habits and onerous duties, and summon them to gentle occupations in the cares of the home? The point is, the author's making here is women shouldn't be doing hard jobs, strenuous jobs, onerous duties. They should be doing gentle occupations. So when we go to C, we can then assume or infer, one step beyond what we just read, that running a household and raising children would entail few activities, given that this distinction is being made here between what women do and what are otherwise strenuous and onerous duties. So notice with C, in some sense, it's really just kind of a paraphrase of what's going on here. And if anything, if it's any farther than that, it's just one step away. We're not really reasoning much farther outside of what's in this text. So we'll go with C. Require skills similar to those needed to run a country or business. Doesn't mention that, so we'll go with C. Answer looks to be between 25 and 30, so that looks like C. We'll just check 4 to 6 and the rest. 4 to 6 says nothing about household duties. 13 to 17 says nothing about household duties. And 30 to 35 says nothing about household duties, so C is going to be the answer. Looks like we've done all the questions for passage 1. Let's just finish passage 1, and then we'll go on to passage 2. This is sufficient. We need not invoke principles that are inapplicable to the question. Let us not make rivals of life's companions. You truly must, allow the persistence of a union that no interest, no rivalry can possibly undo. Understand that the good of all demands this of you. So that's passage 1. Let's go on now to passage 2 questions. According to the author of passage 2, in order for society to progress, women must what? Well, don't really know the answer yet. We'll leave this to later because it's general. But 35 we can do, and we want to find the meaning of the word reason. Contending for the rights of woman, my main argument is built on this simple principle, that if she be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue, for truth must be common to all, or it will be inefficacious with respect to its influence on general practice. And how can woman be expected to cooperate unless she know why she ought to be virtuous? Unless freedom strengthen her reason till she comprehend her duty and see in what manner it is connected with her real good. So reason here, I guess it's the general sense of reason, right? Thought, rationality, right? Her thought processes, right? Strengthen her reason, strengthen her logic. Something like that. Let's go to the choices. Reason most nearly means motive. It's not talking about strengthen her motive till she comprehend her duty. Notice the word here, comprehend, understand. It's about how well she thinks. So it's not motive, it's not sanity, right? It's not about her being insane or sane. Intellect looks pretty good. That goes with reason, with thinking, logic, rationality. Explanation, strengthen her explanation. If you plug this in directly, it just doesn't make any sense, right? Rule 3. Doesn't make sense in standard usage. Unless freedom strengthen her explanation. That's very odd. And more importantly, it doesn't fit in the context. So we'll get rid of D and we'll go with C. In passage 2, the author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders have what? Looks probably specific, but we don't know where it is yet. We do have a part 2 question that follows up. Looks like 38 through 41 are dual, so we're going to leave those. Let's go back then. Let's mark off 41 to 75, and let's find this answer. Right, so we'll keep reading, and we'll try to find out what the freedoms granted by society's leaders have done. If children are to be educated to understand the true principle of patriotism, their mother must be a patriot, and the love of mankind, from which an orderly train of virtue spring, can only be produced by considering the moral and civil interest of mankind. But the education and situation of woman at present shuts her out from such investigations. Consider, sir, dispassionately these observations, for a glimpse of this truth seemed to open before you when you observed that to see one half of the human race excluded by the other from all participation of government was a political phenomenon that, according to abstract principles, it was impossible to explain. If so, on what does your constitution rest? If the abstract rights of man will bear discussion and explanation, those of woman, by a parity of reasoning, will not shrink from the same test. Though a different opinion prevails in this country, built on the very arguments which you use to justify the oppression of women, prescription. Consider, I address you as a legislator, whether when men contend for their freedom and to be allowed to judge for themselves respecting their own happiness, it be not inconsistent and unjust to subjugate women, even though you firmly believe that you are acting in the manner best calculated to promote their happiness. Who made man the exclusive judge, if women partake with him the gift of reason? Okay, so we're looking for what the author claims about the freedoms granted by society's leaders. Perhaps this is a keyword. I'm not sure if I noticed that. Let's see. We'll kind of skim through again, try to find some keyword related to society's leaders. Let's see. I mean, I don't recall seeing anything about society's leaders. In fact, I can't quite find anything in the passage so far that really fits with this about the freedoms granted. So in this case, let's go to the choices. Let's see what we can find, and we'll try to justify it from there. The author claims that freedoms granted by society's leaders have privileged one gender over the other. That seems reasonable. Fits the main idea of the passage, right? Which is that women don't have the same opportunities or rights as men, particularly in the educational arena. So A might work. How about B? Resulted in a general reduction in individual virtue. Not sure it mentioned anything like that. We'll come back to this one. We'll come back to A and B. Put squiggly. Caused arguments about the nature of happiness. I don't think we saw any arguments about the nature of happiness. Notice they did recycled word right here, right? Recycled word. They're reusing the word happiness from line 75, which also ends up being a choice for the part 2 question. A little bit tricky, but notice nothing here says that the rights granted by society's leaders have caused arguments about the nature of happiness. They just mention happiness in this part of the passage. It doesn't relate to this question. Ensured equality for all people. That's obviously false. It's really the opposite of A. So I'm liking A, but let's just double check and make sure that B doesn't mention anything. Now, again, it's kind of a recycled word situation because here, line 45, they've used the word virtue. And notice it does say that if she be not prepared by education to become the companion of man, she will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue, right? So it might say, well, there you go. If women don't get certain rights, then they will not be able to continue the growth of society's virtue, generally speaking. But notice there's a few problems with B, even if you take that tack. Number one, it's not about individual virtue. It's about virtue overall in society. It doesn't mention individuals here at all. Second, the question's asking about the authors or the freedoms granted by society's leaders, not about freedoms restricted or prevented. That it's not about freedoms that are withheld from women. So for that reason, I can get rid of B. And A makes sense, right? I mean, it fits in with the topic of the passage, and it fits this part, actually, right? Consider, I address you as legislator, whether when men contend for their freedom and to be allowed to judge for themselves respecting their own happiness, it be not inconsistent and unjust to subjugate women, even though you firmly believe that you're acting in the manner best calculated to promote their happiness. Okay, so that looks pretty good. I mean, I would go to, this is a very tough one. I would go to each of the lines and try to analyze it and go from there and see which one fits best with A. The issue is we didn't really find the answer originally, so we can't go right to the lines. And if this happens, just go to each of the references, try to judge it the best you can given the answer to 36. Okay, so 41 to 45 talks about how if women are not given education, they will stop the progress of knowledge and virtue, which doesn't say anything about privileging one gender over the other. And it doesn't say that anything, and as we've discussed for 36, this is not really about virtue. It doesn't really go to the idea about one group having privilege over another. It just talks about the general degradation, shall we say, of knowledge and virtue. So we can get rid of A. 45 to 47, truth must be common to all, or it will be inefficacious with respect to its influence on general practice. So here, again, doesn't say anything about freedoms given to one group that privileges them over the other. 65 to 66 doesn't say anything about anything we saw in 36. And then 72 to 75, this is what I kind of picked at before. When men contend for their freedom and to be allowed to judge for themselves, respecting their own happiness. In other words, men are allowed to choose for themselves what their happiness looks like, and they get to decide for women what their happiness looks like as a result. So that would go with this idea of privileging one gender over the other. So we're going to go with D on this one. A couple of tricky questions here in the sense that it was a little bit hard to find the answer in our first read through. So if that happens, you got to go right to the choices. That's fine. Just be extra careful that you're not justifying something that wasn't quite in the original. Let's just finish reading this passage and then we'll do the duels. Who made man the exclusive judge if women partake with him the gift of reason? By the way, this is something that we read before and it makes kind of the same point, right? Men being the exclusive judge over women. In this style, argue tyrants of every denomination, from the weak king to the weak father of a family. They are all eager to crush reason, yet always assert that they usurp its throne only to be useful. Do you not act a similar part when you force all women, by denying them civil and political rights, to remain immured in their families, groping in the dark? So before we go to the duels, as you know, what we want to do is talk about the relationship between the passages. And it's clear, we kind of knew from the beginning, that 2 is a direct response to 1 and disagrees very strongly with what's going on in 1, right? 1's making the point that, yes, it's true that men and women don't have equal rights, but in the end, that's best for everybody. Whereas 2 is making the point that, no, it's not best for everybody. And more importantly, why do you have the right to determine what is best for everybody? So let's go to our dual passage questions. In line 61 to 65, the author of passage 2 refers to a statement made in passage 1 in order to what? So this was the portion where she quotes something that we read in passage 1, and that we want to know why she quoted it. What's the function? What's the reason she did that? Consider, sir, dispassionately these observations, for a glimpse of this truth seemed to open before you when you observed. So notice she's kind of revealing an inconsistency or an hypocrisy in his argument, that he himself makes the claim that ultimately undermines his own argument. He acknowledges that, at first it may not seem possible to explain this differences in rights based on abstract reasoning. And she'll go on to say, yes, that's exactly the point. How come you overlook that? So let's see what we've got. Call into question the qualifications of the authors of passage 1 regarding gender issues. It's not about qualifications, whether they're qualified or not. It's about whether their argument is consistent. Dispute the assertion made about women in the first sentence of passage 1. Was this the first sentence of passage 1? So the first sentence of passage 1 is indeed what's referenced here, I believe. Let's just double check that that's actually the same sentence. To see 1/2, possible to explain. I mean, it's similar, possible to explain, but then that's not actually identical. It's very similar to what we saw in this sentence, but if anything, it's not disputing that assertion. It's saying, listen, you got it right. This is something that you saw a glimpse of truth when you said this. So they're not disputing it, because the author is saying, listen, you made this point and it's true. How come you didn't think about that a little harder? Develop her argument by highlighting what she sees as flawed reasoning in passage 1. Yeah, listen, you made this point and then you kind of ignored it. It's a very critical point that you have to consider if you're going to actually think about this issue. Validate the concluding declarations made by the author of passage 1, about gender roles. No, it's not validating it. It's opposing it, right? This is exactly the opposite of what we're looking for here, right? It's not validating them, which means kind of saying that they're true. It's instead going against them and saying that, listen, this author is being a hypocrite, is being inconsistent in his reasoning. So we'll go with C. What best describes the overall relationship between passage 1 and 2? We talked about this. 2 clearly rejects the statements made in 1. 2 strongly challenges the point of view of 1, absolutely. 2 draws alternative conclusions from the evidence presented in passage 1. So be very careful here. Is there any evidence in passage 1? The issue is no. There are arguments made There are reasons given, but there's no specific facts or evidence or data given here. And especially if B were to be the answer, we would want to see those pieces of evidence, those data, discussed specifically in 2 as well, and given an alternate interpretation. Sure, alternative seems like it works because they're different, but 2 is attacking an argument, not reevaluating data or evidence. So we can get rid of B. Passage 2 elaborates on the proposal presented in passage 1. There is no, again, proposal in passage 1. It's an argument. It's an argument about why the state of affairs as they're currently constituted are fair and good, but the author's not making a proposal about how things should change. 2, if anything, is making the proposal, not 1, so we can get rid of C. Passage 2 restates in different terms the argument presented in passage 1. No, it's not really restating it. I mean, certainly, perhaps on some level is summarizing the argument of passage 1 so that she can attack it. But again, the core relationship here, as we discussed earlier, is 2 is disagreeing with 1. So we'll go with A. The authors of both passages would most likely agree with which of the following statements about women in the 18th century. So this is one of those tough questions where we know the passages oppose one another, and yet we're trying to find something that they both would agree on. And at first that seems not quite possible that that would happen, but obviously there must be some answer. And usually with these, I recommend just go right to the choices because it's very hard to predict sometimes what their agreement's going to be. So, their natural preferences were the same as those of men. Certainly passage 1 would not say that. Passage 1's whole point was men and women inclined to different things. They're different people, right? Men are different from women, therefore they're going to like and be good at different things. Therefore, they have different interests, different jobs, different duties. So, maybe 2 would agree with that, but 1 definitely wouldn't. They needed a good education to be successful in society. 2 says this, so passage 2 is wrong here. Passage 2, or passage 1 was wrong for A. Passage 2 is right for B, but notice passage 1 would not make this point, that women need a good education. The point of 1 is that women don't need an education because they're going to be in the home, raising families. They don't need to bother themselves with that kind of thing. Whereas 2 says, yes, they do. So 1, this is something that's not true for both, so we can get rid of B. They were just as happy in life as men were. I would say that passage 1 might say something like that, again, because it's all about the greatest good for the greatest number, that this is the best way to organize society, according to 1. But 2 would not agree with that, because 2 disagrees with pretty much everything 1 says, more or less. And this whole discussion in this paragraph, we talked a little bit about this before, about why is it that men get to judge who is happy and who is not, implying that maybe women would like to have some say in what makes them happy, implying that maybe they're not super happy, right? So we can, for that reason, we can get rid of C. It doesn't fit with both. They generally enjoyed fewer rights than men did. Yeah, I mean, this is an assumption that underlies both of these pieces, right? 1 tries to justify why that's okay, whereas 2 tries to show why that's not okay. But they both take as a premise, as a starting point, that women have fewer rights. So D is true, so we'll go with D. How would the authors of passage 1 most likely respond to the points made in the final paragraph of 2? So 2 basically says that people who argue this way, right, the way that passage 1 argues, are tyrants. They're the king, the father, they're eager to crush reason, but they assert it only to be useful. Do you not act a similar part when you force all women, by denying them civil rights, to remain immured in their families groping in the dark? In other words, the point of passage 2, the end of the last paragraph, is this type of argument is the argument made by oppressors, by tyrants. So how would 1 respond to that? Not exactly clear, probably just returning my guess to their original argument, which is, well, maybe that's the case, but this is the best way to organize society so that everybody is happy. And that if women went off and started being like men, you would disturb the natural order, and therefore people would be less happy, blah, 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 blah. That would likely be passage 1's response to it, based on what we read. Women are not naturally suited for the exercise of civil and political rights. Unfortunately, this is probably what passage 1 would say, right? The whole point is that women don't need certain rights because that's not best for them, according to passage 1. So that looks pretty good. So we can get we can probably keep A. Men and women possess similar degrees of reasoning ability. Passage 1 would not say that, because passage 1's point is that men and women are different, and women are suited for other things that don't necessarily have to do with reason. Women do not need to remain confined to their traditional family duties. This is the opposite of this. This is exactly passage 1's argument, that women should be confined to those duties. The principles of natural law should not be invoked when considering gender roles. I believe passage 1 does itself invoke natural law, right? What is natural, right? The wishes of nature. So, right, they're peaceful inclinations. So passage 1 does, in fact, cite itself natural law, or what is natural. So again, we'll go with A. Women are not naturally suited for the exercise of civil and political rights. That would be the argument of passage 1. I believe, actually, I skipped 34. So should have done this one earlier after we did the passage 2 questions. That's fine. I mean, we have a pretty good understanding of what's going on in 2 anyway, so no big deal. So let's see. According to the author of passage 2, in order for society to progress, women must what? Well, the whole point of this is that women must have education. If they're going to teach their children, if they're going to be companions to men, they need to have the same exercise of their reason, the same educational opportunities. Women must enjoy personal happiness and financial security. I mean, that could be part of it, right? This could be true. But this is not specifically what's discussed in 2. Follow all currently prescribed social rules. No, just the opposite. That the way society is set up is not fair and should be changed. Women must replace men as figures of power and authority. Again, this is quite strong. You would have to see specifically parts of the text where they need to say, where passage 2 says, oh, women should replace men, and it doesn't say that. Whereas D looks perfect, right? Receive an education comparable to that of men. That's the whole argument in the second passage, right? This discussion of education, more education, right? That's what passage 2 is focusing on. All right, double check. Looks like we got all the answers. Let's move on to the last passage.